The helicopter blades roared as dust whipped through the air, but two security guards stood directly in its path, hands raised as if they owned the sky. "You can't land here. This is HOA property," one of them yelled, blocking a rescue operation in broad daylight. My heart raced. Lives were at stake, yet they refused to move. "Step aside," I said, "but Karen," their leader, smirked. "I don't care if the president's on board, no landing without my permission." The pilot's eyes went wide, but before anyone could react, the door creaked open. And that's when she realized she'd just stopped the governor. Karen wasn't just the head of the HOA security, she was the embodiment of entitlement. Her authority stretched beyond the property lines of her precious little HOA, and she made sure everyone knew it. I'd been dealing with her constant passive-aggressive notes, fines, and unannounced inspections ever since I moved onto the ranch. But today, this was different. As the helicopter descended, I could see her standing there, hands raised, daring us to land. "You can't land here. This is HOA property," she shouted like she was the one controlling the airspace. Her words were ridiculous, considering the land was mine, paid for in full, and registered under my name. I tried to reason with her, explaining that the landing was an emergency, but she wouldn't listen. Instead, she smirked, tilting her head as if the whole situation amused her. "I don't care if it's the president. No one lands without my permission," she spat, stepping closer with that infuriating look of superiority. Her control freak tendencies were on full display, and it was clear she thought she could dictate everything, even the lives of others. But she was about to find out how wrong she was. I moved to this ranch for the quiet. After years of working in the city, the constant noise and the pressure, I wanted something different. The idea of owning my own piece of land where I could set my own pace was the dream I'd been chasing for years. The ranch was perfect, far enough from the chaos, but close enough to town when I needed supplies. The house was old but solid, the fields were wide open, and the sky stretched endlessly above me. It was mine, paid off, and registered under my name, which gave me a sense of security I hadn't realized I needed. At first, everything was smooth. The HOA didn't seem like much. A few basic rules about fences and lawn care, nothing I couldn't handle. I'd gotten a couple of notes about grass getting a little long, and sure there were the usual minor things, but nothing that felt like a big deal. In the beginning, Karen seemed like one of those HOA types who'd make a fuss about small things, but then disappear into the background. She sent her notes, made sure the property looked acceptable, and I figured that was the end of it. But that's not how Karen worked. Slowly, her presence started to grow. At first it was little things, a suggestion to paint the fence, a different color, a reminder that the trees along the driveway needed trimming. I tried to keep everything in line, figuring it wasn't worth the trouble to resist. But Karen didn't stop there. She started showing up at odd hours, inspecting the property without warning, making a note of things she thought needed improvement. She'd poke around my land, walk right onto my property without asking, and then tell me how I should handle the situation with the HOA. I was starting to feel like I wasn't the one in charge of my land anymore. Karen acted like she had the right to decide what was best for me, and each time I pushed back, the rules seemed to shift. At first I chalked it up to the typical HOA nonsense, but over time, I realized Karen was more than just a nuisance. She was trying to control every aspect of my life on this ranch. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was trying to impose her own will on me. And that's when things started to go sideways. What was once a peaceful retreat had become a battleground. I couldn't escape her reach. And when the helicopter landed and Karen tried to block it, that was the tipping point. I'd had enough. It started with small annoyances, notes in the mailbox about my grass being too tall, or a tree that had slightly encroached on the neighbor's fence. At first I thought it was just part of living in an HOA, a minor inconvenience that came with the territory. But Karen wasn't content with that. Soon I was getting visits. Not from the usual compliance officers, but from her. She'd show up unannounced, dressed in her typical power trip uniform, dark sunglasses, hands on her hips, ready to make sure every single rule was being followed to the letter. The first time she stopped by for an inspection, I was out in the field tending to the horses. She marched right up to me, clipboard in hand like she had some grand authority. "Your mailbox isn't aligned correctly," she said, pointing to the post as if it were a serious violation. "It's 1 inch off. Fix it." I looked at her, trying to keep my calm. "It's just a mailbox," I said, but she didn't budge. "Well, it's in the rules," she replied. "I'll have to fine you if it's not fixed within 48 hours. I tried to laugh it off, but Karen wasn't joking. That fine arrived in the mail 2 days later, and that was just the beginning. Soon, Karen's harassment escalated. I'd find her walking around my property, measuring things, taking notes without my consent, One day she showed up with a contractor who was just checking the land for potential issues, as she put it. I had no idea who the guy was, and I certainly didn't invite him on my property. When I asked Karen what she was doing, she gave me that same condescending smile. "It's part of the HOA's responsibility," she said. "You can't keep ignoring the rules." "I'm not ignoring anything," I snapped back, but Karen was already turning her back to me, walking toward the contractor, as if I didn't even exist. I could feel the walls closing in. The boundaries I'd once thought were mine were no longer under my control. It wasn't just about the property anymore, it was about power, and Karen was intent on showing me who held it. Things took a darker turn when I found the first real damage. One morning I went out to check the horses and noticed the mailbox was completely knocked over, the post snapped in half. No note, no warning, just destruction. I had a gut feeling it was Karen's doing, but I couldn't prove it. The incident left me unsettled, but it didn't end there. A few weeks later I discovered something worse. My security cameras had been tampered with, the wires were cut, the cameras disabled. At first I thought it was a break-in attempt, but when I reviewed the footage, I saw someone who looked like one of Karen's associates sneaking around late at night cutting the wires. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was personal. She was crossing a line, and I knew that if I didn't act, it would only get worse. The tipping point came when I received a call from the sheriff's office. Apparently Karen had filed a complaint claiming I was violating HOA rules by running a business on my property without permission. It was a total lie. There was no business, no anything that would even remotely fit her claim. I had a small ranch, I wasn't doing anything shady, but Karen had convinced enough people to believe otherwise. The sheriff came out to investigate, but I could tell from the moment he stepped onto my land that he wasn't buying her story. He asked me about the supposed business, and I showed him my property, nothing more than open land with a couple of barns and horses. "This is the first time I've heard about a business," he said, scratching his head. But Karen's influence was powerful, and she wasn't about to let her story go. She started pressuring the sheriff's office, calling in favors, trying to push her narrative. The authorities were involved, and this was no longer just a battle between me and an HOA. Karen, it was escalating into a legal nightmare. The day Karen blocked the helicopter, I realized this wasn't just about petty HOA rules anymore. She had crossed a dangerous line. The moment she stepped in front of the helicopter and refused to let it land, I knew there was no going back. The tension was palpable as she stood there, her hands on her hips, her gaze cold and calculating. She was willing to risk everything: lives, safety, and legal consequences just to prove a point. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "We can't delay. We're losing critical time." But Karen didn't care. She stood there staring me down like she was the one in control. And that's when the helicopter doors opened. The figure inside stepped out, calm, composed. It was the governor. He looked at Karen with a mix of confusion and disapproval. "Ma'am," he said in a low, controlled voice, "did you just block a rescue helicopter?" The air changed. Karen's confidence, her arrogance evaporated in an instant. The twist. She didn't even realize who she was up against. She thought she could control me, my land, my ranch. But now she just tried to stop the governor of the state from doing his job. The governor's calm presence immediately shifted the dynamic. Karen froze, her face paling as she processed the reality of the situation. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that her HOA rules trumped everything, but she wasn't dealing with just a ranch owner anymore. She was facing the one person she could not intimidate. "Ma'am," the governor said, his voice steady but firm, "did you just stop a state rescue helicopter from landing?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, her power seemed to collapse in on itself. She was no longer the authority figure. She was the one being questioned. She stumbled back a step, her arrogance now replaced with confusion. "You've just delayed a rescue mission," the governor continued, his gaze unwavering. "You've endangered lives, and for what?" Karen was completely silent now, her bravado shattered in an instant. The helicopter crew, who had been standing nervously, shot her nervous glances as the tension thickened in the air. The wind from the chopper blades felt colder now, as the reality of Karen's actions began to sink in. "You know who I am, right?" I asked, trying to mask the frustration that was building inside me. "I've lived here for years, and yet you come onto my land like you own it, pulling this crap." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't say anything. It was clear she knew she was in way over her head. The governor didn't wait for Karen to respond. Instead, he turned to me and asked, "Is this normal here?" I didn't hesitate. "It's been happening for months. They've been making my life a nightmare. It's like they think the ranch is theirs, that they have control over everything." Karen's face twisted in a mixture of guilt and anger, but she remained silent, unwilling to admit the truth. The governor gave me a sharp nod, then turned back to Karen. And now you've interfered with a state operation. You've put people's lives at risk, including my team's. I stepped forward, a cold resolve setting in. And for what? To play sheriff on a piece of land that isn't yours? That's when Karen's walls truly crumbled. The governor paused and without another word turned back toward the helicopter. As he did, the crowd that had begun to gather murmured among themselves. They too had realized that Karen was no longer the authority figure she once was. The governor's gaze flicked to the two HOA guards standing behind Karen, their faces red with embarrassment. Whose order was it to block the helicopter? He asked. Both guards quickly pointed at Karen as if they were afraid of being dragged into the mess she had created. Karen's eyes flicked from one guard to the other, but there was no denying it. She was alone now. Her false power had been stripped away, leaving her exposed. The final nail in the coffin came when the governor turned back to Karen, his expression now one of controlled disappointment. Do HOA rules override state emergency protocols now? Karen's face went white as the truth of what she had done sank in. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The governor didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence, his calm authority was enough to expose her. You're not in charge here, Karen, I said, finally letting the words spill out. This isn't your land. It never was. Karen, who had once thought she could control everything, now found herself utterly powerless. The wind from the helicopter blades ruffled her hair as she backed away, her hands trembling. The fight had left her, and all that remained was the truth she couldn't hide anymore. The governor didn't wait for her to reply. He simply looked at me and nodded. We're not done yet, but right now, we have an emergency to handle. With that, he turned and we both made our way back toward the helicopter. As we climbed aboard, I looked back one last time. Karen stood there, staring after us, completely lost. As the helicopter soared into the sky, the weight of the situation finally began to lift. Below, the quiet valley stretched out like it always had, as if the chaos never happened. I turned to the governor, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. Thanks for the help, I said, my voice steady, but there was a weight to the words. The governor gave a nod, his expression calm. You stayed calm. Most people would have cracked under the pressure. I took a deep breath, watching the land below. It was my land. Finally, after months of harassment and constant tension, I felt a sense of peace creeping back in. The ranch was still here, untouched by Karen's attempts to control it. But it wasn't just about the property, it was about standing my ground, about the community finally seeing Karen for what she was. The people around us were already beginning to talk, exchanging whispers in the streets. I could feel the shift. No one would be afraid of Karen's empty threats anymore. The HOA's grip had been broken, and that wasn't just a victory for me, it was for everyone who'd been under her rule. The sheriff was already talking to some of the neighbors, explaining what had happened. Karen's reign of power had crumbled, and it was clear that the community was ready to move forward. As the sheriff's deputies escorted Karen away, I felt a small sense of justice settling in. The chaos she'd caused, the months of harassment and power plays, were finally coming to an end. Karen had crossed the line, and now she would face T. The charges against her piled up quickly: trespassing, obstruction of justice, interference with a state emergency operation. It was clear that blocking a rescue helicopter wasn't just a minor infraction, it was a criminal act, one that could have cost lives. As the sheriff led her away, her face was drained of its usual smugness. There was no arguing now. She had made the mistake of thinking she could control, but the fallout didn't stop with Karen. The HOA board, which had supported her actions now, had to answer for the damage she'd caused. The governor made a few calls, and before long, the board was in turmoil. The public was furious, and the pressure was mounting. People who had been too intimidated to speak out before were finally finding their voices. The power that the HOA had once wielded over the community was crumbling. Karen's downfall had exposed the HOA for what it truly was: a small group of people manipulating rules and using fear to control others. The governor assured me that there would be further investigation and changes would be made. The HOA would never be the same, and Karen's influence over it was officially over. As the sheriff's vehicle drove away with Karen inside, my brother stepped forward, his expression serious but calm. I hadn't expected to see him here today, but I knew something big was unfolding. He handed me a folded sheet of paper, which I quickly unfolded. The paper was a hit list with the fire marshal's name at the top. Beneath it, the chilling note read, "Delay him at all costs." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. This wasn't just about Karen anymore, it was bigger. The fire at the ridge hadn't been a random incident. It was part of a calculated plan to delay the state's response to sabotage everything we were working to protect. The The fire marshal, the very man in charge of preventing wildfires, had orchestrated this disaster. My brother's voice was low and controlled as he explained the fire marshal was in on it. Karen was just a pawn, used to create chaos and stop us from getting the help we needed. The governor's face darkened as he read the note. It was clear he was shocked but not surprised. "We've got a bigger problem than we thought," he said, glancing at my brother. "This goes higher than just the HOA." The truth was unraveling quickly, and with it, the full scope of the conspiracy. The fire was a distraction meant to delay the governor's arrival and the rescue operation. But, with Karen exposed and the fire marshal's role now uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The fire marshal's associates were already being rounded up by the sheriff's department. The authorities were taking swift action to dismantle the operation, and Karen's role in it was now crystal clear. She had been manipulated, but that didn't excuse her actions. She would face the consequences of blocking a rescue operation and betraying the community. I watched the fire crews finally contain the last of the flames, the smoke thinning as the danger passed. The ridge was safe, the threat was over. My home, my ranch was secure once again. The governor turned to me, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You didn't just save your ranch today, you saved the entire ridge." I nodded, feeling a rush of pride. "It's not over yet, but we won." My brother slapped me on the back with a grin. Not bad for a rancher. The chaos had subsided, and in its place was a sense of calm. The fire marshal had been exposed, Karen was done, and the HOA was losing its power. My ranch, my land was mine again, and nothing would ever take it from me.